I don't know. It's like just a giant question mark.
Yep. Big purple question mark.
What's up, people? Welcome to my full power Eat Mountain Bike Shootout. Today we've got the Norco Range VLT, but before we get into the bike, we got to thank our sponsors, Marin Service Course, Schwalbe, ENVE, and Form Saddles. Got Peter here, the owner of Marin Service Course. What are we working with?
So here we've got the Norco Range VLT set up with RockShox suspension, 170 rear travel, 180 front travel, mixed wheel design, and it's got the Bosch CX motor, the previous generation.
We're wrapping up our last ride on the bike right now, and then we'll go back to the shop and break it down for you guys.
All right, we just got done riding the Norco Range VLT. First things first, we don't really call this bike the Norco Range anymore, so we got, and we won't for the rest of this interview. So we gotta
Bust out the nickname.
Yeah, we gotta give the backstory on the nickname. What do you got for us?
I mean, well, it's the Grimace, right? This bike goes by Grimace. For those that don't know, it's a McDonald's character. It's like this purple triangle thing with legs. Like, it's just, I don't know why, but I mean, it's purple and it's a big bike. So it's just the Grimace.
Yeah, it's kind of funky looking. It's very purple, and just for some reason, especially after riding it,
So unprofessional.
come on, Nick.
Stop.
That's the intro, dude. For some reason, after riding it too, it just makes sense. So it's been nothing but the Grimace for us. So it's gonna be the Grimace for you too. So what this bike is just the most confusing one on test. This thing threw us for a loop. So what even is it? It's 170, 180, freaking high pivot with like the longest wheelbase on test. So you're just like, this is gonna be the most balls out DH smasher on the test, and it's just like, it's just not though. Like, it was honestly like one of the more responsive bikes, and then in the rough stuff, like it had like a long travel feel. Like it wasn't bad, but it wasn't as good as I think either of us would have expected, being a high pivot, long wheelbase, 170, 180 mil travel bike. So it's just confusing. It's a confusing mix of specs and how that all comes together on the trail.
Well, now that I've gathered myself, for starters, this bike's definitely like, this is unfortunate. Like, it's a trend that's had a couple of these bikes that were too big. This bike definitely was too big.
I mean, this is like 500 mil reach large.
Yeah, I think it's 495.
Yeah.
And that's like once again, that's like well out of my range of what I would, out of what I would consider preferable geometry numbers. One thing I will say though, is it has a steeper, and this was a weird thing riding this bike after riding the Pivot, is that despite having a longer reach, the seat tube is actually steeper, which put my hands I was more comfortable seated climbing this bike. I mean, it's not like by a lot, but it was more comfortable seated climbing on this bike for me than the Pivot. It definitely has also a really, really short chainstay for a bike of its wheelbase, which will come into play for sure. I mean, so it's actually also another interesting fact. This and the Pivot have the same front-rear ratio, but obviously like different wheelbases. So in a sense, it actually did corner similar to the Pivot.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
But it's also a lot longer bike than the Pivot, and it's a lot heavier. Like this is by far also playing into the Grimace. Like, it's a lot heavier than the Park Tool scale couldn't register it. So that means it's north of 60, that's pretty darn heavy for a bike. And you can tell. It's just, when you have this combination of a lot of weight, a long wheelbase and not necessarily, for me, the most balanced geometry, it becomes rather difficult to maneuver and time, like your movements and stuff and like where to go. I mean, ultimately today, riding the bike, I just let the Grimace go where the Grimace wanted to go. And it was pretty fun. Like if I just kind of just let the bike do its thing and kind of like laughed along, it was actually a lot of fun to ride. Like I actually had a lot more fun today riding the bike than I did the first time I rode the bike.
It's like you can't, it's hard to take this bike seriously. Like,
exactly.
It's, some bikes are fun to ride. This bike was more like funny to ride. It's just like, you're just like, you got all this travel. You kind of don't know what to do with it. It's like huge and heavy, and you're just like, let's go.
Yeah, like one thing to that though is like I do feel like one thing the suspension, like it's probably its best quality suspension wise is like it has a crazy amount of pop, which kind of could come back to bite you at times. Like you could like, it's just weird. Like it would bunny hop well, and like my first time out, this was my first, like without riding the bike, my conception of like what it would be like is I didn't think I was gonna like the way it turns just because of the geometry of it. But I'm like, man, if this thing just eats bumps, I'm gonna have a good time. And then so I like, went out of my way to pick bad lines and like run into stuff, and the rear end just like kicked, and it was like, what just happened? Like it just caught me way off guard because in my head I'm like in my head I thought it would perform more like what the Crestline did. Like the Crestline eats bumps and it's sick, and it's just like Crestline and Gas both just devour bumps. And then this thing, it's just funky. Like it just, yeah, like there's a couple things, and I tried it again today, like riding some stuff again, and like let's hit this bump and see what happens. Sure enough, same thing. Like I had my feet get like bounced up and off the pedals at one point, and that's not a fun experience. At least I was able to like land back on, but it was like full feet float, like almost grab swing arm with feet, put the feet back on. Like it was wild. And yeah, so that's what's so strange with it is it's like it's very sled-like and heavy, but then the suspension is like the complete opposite spectrum of like what you would think.
It's like boingy.
Yeah, no, boingy is like the most. That was Brian, like the first run down Hobo. He gets to the bottom, he's like, dude, it's kind of boingy. What does that even mean?
Like, why is it boingy? Like, look at it.
Yeah, it's like a it's strange.
And to your point, like on Hobo in the fast section during our test laps, there's kind of just a rough, chopped out section that I intentionally just stabbed the brakes to see what the bike was gonna do, and this thing stepped out. And I was like, whoa, that was wild. Like, didn't expect that to happen. And yeah, it's like, it's not bad. And I think it like works because it has so much travel, but it's not this like ultra plush experience.
No.
And another thing that I think is worth talking about, it's the weight, but there's some other heavy bikes on the test. This is, still by far the heaviest, but I think it feels like kind of awkwardly placed. Like I feel like I'm kind of like on top of the bike, maybe it's a stretch, but I just don't feel like it's like that at your ankles type feeling. I don't feel like the bike is low slung under me. I don't know if this is right or not, but I feel like it has kind of a higher top tube. But yeah, like heavy bikes can ride really well, but this didn't really translate into like a positive attribute on the trail with like where it was placed. It just kind of like, it felt like an awkward sort of heavy.
I think one thing also, at least what I feel like is the frame feels super stiff.
Yeah.
And I think that might play into part of why it has a tendency to like, it would kick sideways. Like I had a couple instances where I'd like try to track across roots and it would like kind of almost go out from under you. And when you have a big heavy bike doing that, and that's like another, like, it's not like, this is just an example of say like riding too big of a bike. Like mistakes are really hard to correct. And that's, you know, like that's one thing, like the Mondraker, like you can make a mistake, throw it back online and then carry on. Whereas like this thing, because it's like, you know, it's like a freaking battleship. Like it's huge and it's heavy and it's just like, you can't like course correct quickly. And yeah, it was interesting. I also like the shock. The rear end never felt like really particularly good to me. Like I don't, like, you know, running 30% sag, and then I did, you know, one test run, and then I was like, man, the rear feels kind of dead. I was like, I'm going to try one click faster, see if that gets it to move. Because, you know, sometimes when you open up rebound, it allows it to move a little bit better. And it actually got worse. Like, it's weird. And then today I slowed it down, and I actually preferred that feel. But it still felt kind of, it just feels dead.
Yeah,
it's just bizarre. But then it's like, if you run the suspension fast, you get like that good pop, which helps to hide the weight. Like that's one thing I will say, like it does hide the weight pretty well, despite, I mean, it is heavy, but like when you run the rebound like fast, it allows it to pop. It's boingy.
It's boingy.
But then that boinginess can like get out of control. And when you got 60-pound bike out of control, getting like turbo bounced around by the rear suspension, it's like, it's a wild ride. Like it's Grimace's wild ride. And it's a puzzler. Like I am genuinely puzzled by this bike.
Yeah, totally. It's like, and it's like my first lap, I think I had the conception of a lot of people like, oh, this is going to be a sled, you know, planted, going to plow bumps. And then at the bottom, it was just like, why is this sled of a bike, you know, why is it the boingy one?
Like it's like
doesn't make any sense. And the cornering character, you know, I'm 6'1", Nick's 5'11", so I'd say a very appropriately sized large rider. I'd say it's still too big for me. Like, yeah, 495 is still on like the bigger side of what I would want to ride. You know, I can deal with that big of a reach if the chainstay is longer to compensate, but this one isn't. It's like a similar handling characteristic to the pivot where you have to be over the front, but there isn't that response with the suspension, and it's heavy, so it just puts you in some weird situations on the trail. But like, even though I would say it's, you know, we talk about this in like, it's in pretty negative terms, if we're being honest. It was like, I was like laughing my way down the trail. There's like something about it that's like comical. You know? It's why we call it the Grimace. Like, I'm just like, this is a weird, fun experience.
Yeah. I mean, it's definitely not a race bike, that's for sure. I mean, I'm sure Greg Menard could get on it and go really fast, but he's also the GOAT. So honestly, to me, this is like, once again, continuing on the head scratcher route, because the previous version of this bike, and I'm bringing this up because it's just a really weird jump in development. Because the old version, or I guess the previous version of this range, was like pretty much in line with what the gas is. And, you know, it's like, and then you go from that to this. Geometry-wise, yeah. So geometry-wise, the old range, you know, on paper to me, it was like, damn, that's pretty good. Like, really good. Honestly, really good. And, like, all you had to do is put the Bosch motor in the old chassis and, like, put an air shock on it, and it's a super sick bike. You know, like, it would be, you know, didn't happen, obviously, but, like, and then you have this, which is, like, just a weird jump, like, away from what the old bike was. So why that happened, I have no idea, but that's just, like, you know, I'm not, like, a Norco hater out here. Like, I honestly think the acoustic range, that's a bike I would love to ride. Like, it looks really good. And, yeah, like, once again, previous version of this, a little bit of feedback was probably that it was apparently a heavy bike, but, you know, work around that and, you know, figure out how to make it work. And it could have been, like, you know, ultimately, like, what this whole test for me, it's like been almost like a big geometry experiment along with other things, just getting to ride a bunch of different stuff. So this just represents a very extreme end of the spectrum. And yeah, it's interesting. It was a, you know, interesting bike.
Yeah. I don't know if we have like a conclusion on this one. It's just,
it's a bit of a head scratcher. It's a bit of a weird, it's a mixed bag. I don't know where to put it.
Just it's a strange combination of characteristics.
Did you notice the high pivotness of it in any situation?
Absolutely not. So that's that's one thing that actually, after riding the bike, I went and read other reviews of the bike just to like see, am I crazy or is what I experienced in line with other people? And for the most part, a lot of people, like, not many reviews went remotely as in depth. I'd say almost every other review, they did ride the smaller one. So the S3, this is the S4. Other testers are probably around my height riding that bike. So obviously, like, that, I think for me to personally have like a more fair assessment of the bike, I'd have to be on the smaller one just to see and like to really suss out what's going on with the rear suspension. I think would take a lot longer than any of these other bikes. Like, it just had a very different feel. Back to the high pivot question, like, no, it was like, I don't know. Like, it really, and other testers did say that like it was like surprisingly not high pivot feeling. So it's not just me or Ryan. Like, it was weird.
Like, maybe I could feel it a little bit in corners where like
The drive.
just like an axle path of how the bike drove through corners, is it just like it felt like it progressively kind of loaded the front a little bit, which like actually kind of helped. Like, I still didn't like how the bike cornered, but maybe it wasn't as bad as it could have been if it didn't have the high pivot. But like, from a strictly like suspension performance standpoint, I wasn't like, oh, this is like performing so well because of the high pivot. I thought it struggled in areas that I thought the high pivot would be good in.
Absolutely.
And one thing I wanted to touch on the sizing, just with it being, 495 for a large, and we should look, what's the medium?
It's for 467.
Nick knows.
Yeah, I mean, I've looked at the charts. Like,
Yeah,
I've looked at the numbers on these bikes because, like,
So it's like 467 to me is like,
they're all like in between.
it's a much more rideable number, but it's honestly like a little short. So it's like, for me, looking at, if I was looking to buy a Norco, I'm like, there's not really a size that works for me.
And that was also mirrored by a lot of the other things I read. So, yeah, I mean, the one thing that I'll say that did surprise me with the rear suspension, and like, this isn't a negative, is like when you like cutty a corner, like short little corners, it had this crazy forward propulsion. Like, it, for a bike of what it is, it like pumps really well, which is kind of strange. You'd think high pivot tank, but it actually, very responsive to input. I do think also in like rough stuff, I felt like it did pitch a lot.
That I actually was gonna say about that. Yeah.
It like this is like what I'm saying is like when I've the multiple times I've had my feet bounced off the pedals, like I'm coming into like a rough section and it hits and the bike just like dong, just like doesn't like endo, but like it definitely transfers. Like, instead of the wheel moving, it's like the wheel kind of hangs and it hangs up. Honestly, like for a high pivot, it hangs up, which is kind of shocking. So like you hit these bumps and it like pitches you forward, so it's like this like seesawing thing, which is also a function of like longer bikes have a tendency to seesaw a bit. But it was like, that was one thing I definitely noticed in like rough sections, is like, and maybe that's why it like helps to produce traction in the corner, is like it drives the front tire in. Yeah. But like in a straight rough section, it's like a kicking donkey. It's just like,
that is something I wrote in my notes as well, is kind of that
pitching,
that weight pitching, and like that's like something you actually have to deal with a lot on e-bikes, especially in like lower speed stuff, just because there's a lot of weight. But on this bike, it was noticeable.
Yeah,
I'll say that for sure. It's like you could get easily put out of position, out of a good body position, just because the chassis was, doing the front to back thing.
I'll say I did enjoy the bike more if I didn't try to push. Like, if I just kind of like cruised along and just rode along, I was like, this is chill. But if you tried to push, that's where like a lot of the, for me especially, like the flaws came flying out.
If you're just down to like
cruise.
Sit in this comfortable position. You've got all this bike out there in front of you. You kind of enjoy the safe feeling of a long wheelbase, and you just want to boing your way down the trail. And you like purple, this bike's for you.
I don't know. It's like just a giant question mark.
Yep. Big purple question mark. Can someone from Norco tell us more about it?
I watched the video on the yeah, and you can see in the video the dude get pitched forward going down some rocks. So it's like, well, it happens. Not like over the bars, but it has a savage amount of input into your feet. Like it really, at least that's like, of all the bikes on the test, it's like, damn, like my feet are taking a pounding. Any more positivity? Anyone want to share? Talking stick? Maybe a coil shock would be sick on it.
Yeah, I mean, that's, it's worth a try.
Make it 70 pounds.
Yeah, just throw more weight at it.
Something that I like tried to mess around with was like, if I leaned back, would the suspension work better?
That's pretty deep.
I was fucking trying to make it work. Like I was genuinely like, I'm like, what? Honestly, just laughing and just like riding slow.
Being oblivious, like as long as you don't think too hard about it, that's the best strategy. I don't know. You guys tell us where we screwed up. Tell us where we're going wrong.
Yeah, like what don't we know?
Yeah, I'm not saying we've got all the answers, but at the very least, this one was a head scratcher. So I think we'll leave it at that. We've rambled on too much. Thanks, Peter at Marin Service Course, for letting us take this thing out.
It was a real experience.
And thanks to ENVE, Schwalbe, and Form Saddles for making this whole project possible. This is the last video in this whole shoot. We're freaking smoked. So we're going to sign off and go to bed. But thanks for watching. We'll catch you guys in the next one.
Real heavyweight champion of the, of the test. For playing bumper cars, I want this bike. Coquitlam, BC. Working at McDonald's every day, stealing hamburgers. The Grimace.